Hello and welcome to The Big Picture. An unimaginable and tectonic change has taken place in North America with the revival of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. Seen as an historic sea change, it has left the world wonderstruck and the peoples of the two countries divided. While President Obama's decision has been welcomed by a significant section of Americans, the Republicans have opposed it. Even among the Cubans, while Cubans living in Cuba have welcomed it with emotional joy, the Cuban Americans are divided or mostly opposed. This deal worked out with the help of Pope Francis, who facilitated several secret talks between the two governments, needs understanding. What will this mean to Cuba and its people? And can Obama's brave decision be implemented in the way he hopes to? Many questions need an answer to understand this historical revival of the US-Cuban relations. We will discuss it today with Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the United States, Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, Center for Canadian, US and Latin American Studies at the JNU, Professor Kamal Mitra Chenoy of School of International Relations, JNU, and KP Nayar, Consulting Editor of the Telegraph. Welcome to all of you. Meera Shankar, was this something expected?
No, it wasn't expected. It was something which was worked out behind the scenes.
And very secretly.
Very secretly. Talks were held in Canada and also with the help of the Vatican. And essentially, it was for the release of US intelligence agent Alan Gross, who had been imprisoned for distributing satellite phones to Jewish groups in Cuba 5 years ago and sentenced to 20 years in prison. And in exchange for that, the US also released three Cuban spies, the Cuban Five.
Three of the
Cuban Five were released. President Obama acknowledged the role that Pope Francis had played and said that the Pope had made a personal appeal to him and to President Raul Castro to work out this appeal. But one thing has been there, and that is President Obama has relaxed the travel bans, at least on Cuba, some years ago for certain categories of persons, including researchers, students, and so on. And the other was that within Latin America, it was not Cuba which was being isolated, it was US which was being isolated on Cuba because Cuba was finding increasing acceptance within the Organization of American States, all the Latin American countries. So if you see Hillary Clinton's book, Hard Choices, she's mentioned in that, you know, our embargo imposed in 1960 with a view to squeezing out Castro from power proved counterproductive.
Yes, we will come to the other aspects of it. Professor Mahapatra, you think that this kind of a revival, this tectonic shift, as some people are calling, what kind of a impact will it have?
The impact is going to be...
Because we'll talk of the impact in America first.
The impact is going to be good for the American businessmen and the traders. A large number of Americans are looking forward to get even Havana cigar very quickly. And the American business communities have already started exploring the possibility of doing business with Cuba. It has a large mining sector, the largest deposit of nickel in Cuba. And tourism is another big potential. The hoteliers, they are also looking forward to having good business in Cuba. But these are all expectations. It is going to move very slowly. It is not, it is going to be a tectonic shift, but it is not completely new because way back in 1977, Jimmy Carter initiated it. And subsequently, we find that Bill Clinton for 3 years tried his best to do what Obama is doing now. He miserably failed. Obama, the moment he came to power, he talked about negotiating with the Cubans and the Iranians and even North Koreans and all. He tried his best slowly.
In fact, during his election campaign, he was talking about it.
He was talking,
it was part of his...
He liberalized a little bit. So 2013, America was the 4th largest exporter of agricultural goods to Cuba. And large number of Cubans were getting visas, about 20,000 of them. 35,000 of Cubans were applying for even immigration visa and all that. So things were moving slowly. But this negotiation that took place over 18 months, and suddenly Obama and Raul Castro simultaneously saying that they are going to...
They were quite dramatic, actually.
Dramatically saying that they are going to restore
dramatic.
the diplomatic relationship. That was something new and surprising to the world.
Okay, Professor Chenoy, what is the politics of this? What will be the politics of this internationally in that region?
Well, you know, I think the whole problem with Cuba was that the Americans thought that Cuba would be a beacon for revolution and would stir up the rest of Latin America. Obviously, by this stage, it realized no such thing would happen, and therefore it would be in American interest to increase ties with Cuba. Cuba is no longer any threat. The red flag of revolution in Latin America has ebbed. So there's no threat that he had to worry about. He could open up for the Cubans who are in the United States, who if they move to Cuba might also change the politics there.
It might change the politics in Cuba. Nayar, you know, it's very interesting what some of the you have written today also in your newspaper. It's very interesting to read what you have written. It is this kind of division which is happening within America. The Republicans are obviously not happy about it. Even the Cuban Americans living in Florida and other places, they are not too happy. Why?
Well, there is a domestic problem in this entire issue, because the Hispanic community in the United States is now very sharply divided between the Cuban exiles and the non-Cuban exiles. And the Democrats in particular found that the Cuban exiles had become a kind of mafia, and they became so powerful in Florida that without their support, nobody could win Florida. And without winning Florida, nobody could become
the president of the US.
Yes,
it's quite remarkable, actually. One state decides that kind of a situation.
Yeah, that's a problem. That's a problem with the electoral college, you see.
And Al Gore was this sufferer.
That's right, yes. Yeah. I mean, even Bill Clinton won in 1992. It was a freak because Ross Perot took away 19% of the votes. Otherwise, Bill Clinton would have lost the election in 1992. So, if Democrats are to win again, they had to do something about the Cuban American community. And the Hispanics, one of Barack Obama's greatest achievements is that he mobilized the Hispanic community behind the Democratic Party, to the exclusion of Cuban Americans. And the domestic dimension of this foreign policy decision is that President Obama is trying to consolidate the Hispanic community behind the Democratic Party for the 2016 elections. And it was necessary to deal a body blow to the Cuban American community in order to get Florida.
Is this a body blow to them?
Well, I think so, because you see, even within the Cuban American community, the younger generation, the generation that is below 25, I've met so many of them, they don't have the same antipathy towards Fidel Castro like their fathers and grandfathers had. So the Cuban community is also changing, but there is the money element in it. You see, apart from politics, the Cuban American community is a huge money-making machine involved in all kinds of things, including very unsavory things. So there are wheels within wheels within wheels, and that is the domestic dimension of this whole decision.
What about, Meera, what about the Republican opposition to it? They are saying that we are not going to support this. Some of the measures which Obama has announced needs congressional vote. And with Republicans gaining control over both Senate and the House, you think how much of what he's hoping to do can be achieved?
Well, he hasn't lifted the embargo.
That's right.
The trade embargo remains in place. The travel bans remain in place, but they have been eased.
Right.
And a larger number or categories of people will be allowed to travel, but tourism will not be permitted. So what President Obama has done is to use his presidential executive powers to move the agenda forward, but has not been able to address the formal embargo. On the economic side, US credit cards will now be accepted in Cuba. US institutions will be able to open accounts at Cuban financial institutions, and tourists of Americans visiting Cuba will be allowed to bring back $100 worth of tobacco products. So these are minor steps.
These are very minor things.
Minor steps. But, you know, the fact that the US will establish a diplomatic embassy, a full-fledged embassy in Cuba, the fact that the State Department is reviewing the declaration of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism.
Right.
I think these are political moves which say a lot. The actual nitty-gritty of the relationship will depend on getting Congress to formally lift the embargo. Now,
so you think the pressure will be on the Congress?
If I may say, some of the Republicans have actually welcomed the negotiations for the release of Alan Gross, and some were there to welcome Alan Gross when he came back. And of course, Alan Gross himself has said that this is a game changer which he supports, and he hopes that both the countries can move beyond their, mutual belligerence. So I think
decades long, 50 years, half a century.
Yeah. So let's see how it moves going forward.
Professor Mahapatra, the question is one is about these moves what Meera was talking about, the kind of political moves which has been made. It will put pressure on the Republicans, and also the involvement of the Pope in all these things. Do you think that will also have some measure or some effect on the Republicans to ease what they are now showing as strong opposition?
You see, the Republican Party is looking forward to 2016 election. On that basis, they want to make the life of Barack Obama in next 2 years pretty hell. That this guy is not a go-getter, he cannot achieve anything, whether it is foreign policy, whether it is domestic politics. More recently, when Obama had a new policy on immigration, Republicans shouted back. And now this is the second initiative that he's taking, and the Republicans are opposing it. And in fact, the Cuban Americans are divided over it. As Mr. Nayar said, the younger generation are supportive of it. The older generations are shrinking in number by the day. And that is why, ever since the 125,000 Cubans migrated to the US in 1980, Florida has become a swing state.
Right.
Now, the Republican Party, looking at the 2016 election, want to strategize and have that support base to make life difficult for the Democratic Party. So this is the internal politics in the United States. But Obama and the State Department and the Pentagon, they are looking at it in a strategic diplomatic way that after 50 years plus, when they could not change the regime, why not have dialogue with them? Exactly. And on the Cuban side, they have been watching what China has done, what Vietnam has done. They want to really reopen. They are getting dependent on Venezuela. Every day they buy about 100,000 barrels per day of oil from Venezuela.
And Venezuela itself is having problems now.
Yeah.
Kamal, Mitra, Chenoy, what about the politics within Cuba? You think, after all these years of the Castro's rule in Cuba, this breakthrough which has come ultimately can prove counterproductive to them as far politically?
I don't think so. The whole notion of communism, of revolution has undergone a change. And the move of Raul Castro coming into the leadership was important because he was much more flexible than Fidel. And I think it is a correct analysis to say that these people are not worried about revolution or what is going to happen. I'm referring to the younger generation. And the fact that the Pope intervened is also very important for them. So I think this has been a good move by Obama. Even if he stopped in the Congress, the Republicans will pay a price for it in the elections. So I think it's a good move. They have learned from the other Latin American countries, going back to Brazil, Bolivia, and all of that. And they're going ahead with it, and it was actually quite overdue. But the problem was how to connect with the United States and get over the blocks there.
Okay. Nayar, inside Cuba, now they're talking about, democratization of the politics and more open. You think that will happen there? And you think this will influence any change politically within Cuba?
Actually, I mean, why just talk of just Cuba? I think all of Latin America is finding a kind of middle path in terms of their political ideology and structure, because you know, unlike while leftist regimes have collapsed everywhere else, in Latin America they are actually on the rise.
Right.
I mean, Bolivia, Ecuador, Uruguay recently had an election where a left-leaning president is in power now. But these are not the rabid leftist regimes that they used to have. Brazil is an example.
Right.
I mean, even Venezuela, you know, I mean, Hugo Chavez used to go to church. So I think the whole of Latin America is finding the middle path. And I think that will become true of Cuba also, you know. I mean, Cuba will remain, of course, the state with the Communist Party in charge. But one expects a considerable amount of liberalization. Already there has been quite a lot of liberalization. So I think this will, actually the embargo didn't work. It didn't change anything. But this may actually change things for the better for the Cubans, as well as make Cuba more acceptable to right-wingers in the United States in particular.
Cold, you know, I don't know, but I think I read somewhere, maybe you have mentioned it. This is the actual end of the Cold War. Would you look at it that way? The Cold War ended in the 90s, but this was the last bastion of the Cold War.
But I think,
but North Korea is still there.
No, also I think, you know, I mean, this is not the end of history. I think we are seeing various phases of the end of the Cold War. But as this phase ends, I think there is another phase.
Second one is starting.
Yes, another phase in
Professor
Ukraine.
Mahapatra, would you look
I look at it slightly differently. I think that all said and done, there are people who are strategizing in the State Department and the Pentagon. They think that now that Obama has now slightly liberalized, until now only $500 could be sent by the Cuban exiles back home. Now they've expanded to 2,000. This is going to empower a large number of families within Cuba. The Americans are trying to open up the internet market in Cuba and sell cell phones and all. So they hope that
the
this
consumerism,
the new freedom and empowerment will ultimately bring down the regime that they have, at least make them more moderate.
Which disturbed them for 50 years and they couldn't do anything about it.
If I may say, actually the embargo helped to freeze a situation in Cuba because it allowed the Cubans to claim that they were under, you know, their sovereignty was under threat. I think if
that was Castro's, calling card. Virtually.
And in fact, it also, as Hillary Clinton recognized, was proving counterproductive for their larger or broader agenda within Latin America itself, where the US is seen as being on the wrong side of history by many of the countries there. They've learnt also, you know, from a period where they really looked at overthrowing regimes such as the one in Chile, they have now learned to live with and work with the Latin American regimes, even if uncomfortably. So there's been an evolution in the way in which the US approaches Latin America, with it showing greater sophistication in its policy. And I think this opening up to Cuba will generate new impulses, will unfreeze a situation, and will make the Cubans more inclined to experiment with the kind of economic and political reforms they may want to put in place. Because the embargo, as I said, in a sense, acted as a weight preventing, political change.
Political change, and it gave some kind of a handle to the government there to say that we are under siege. Professor Chenoy, within Cuba, as I was asking you, as I was asking others here also, do you expect major political changes to take place?
I think the changes will take place initially a bit slowly. But Fidel is already out of the reckoning.
Right.
Raul Castro will go. And I think it's a good point made that Cuba is now going to learn from Latin America. Instead of being an isolated extension of the United States, which took care of everything it wanted by not letting them have anything. So the international situation has changed. The balance of global forces has changed.
Okay. Nayar, the kind of deal which has been worked out, what is the compromise? I mean, she was talking about, the exchange of prisoners and things like that, but it can't be just that. Do you suspect there is something more than what meets the eye?
You see, right now we are discussing the domestic situation in Cuba, but I think we also need to talk about the domestic situation in the United States, really. I mean, Obama is actually not telling the whole truth when he said that the embargo has failed to achieve our objective. The fact of the matter is that it was beginning to have a backlash. Right. In 2006, I happened to meet a group of American students who are doing medical education in Cuba. At that time, there were 100 of them, I mean, these people couldn't afford medical education in the US. Right. And George W. Bush ordered them back, but they were not refusing to come back,
They were refusing to come back.
They were refusing to come back. So you have a situation where, you have American citizens who are on the point of, they're not actually renouncing, but effectively they are renouncing their American citizenship. They prefer to stay on in Cuba and continue their medical education. Then again, the number of people traveling to Cuba increased phenomenally, every difficult law has a loophole. Like, it's illegal for American citizens to travel to Cuba. But if you go and then Treasury Department files a complaint, the lawyers have discovered that if you contest the complaint, it goes to a specific court, and there are not enough judges in the court. So it's never settled, There have been cases which have been pending for 8 years. So actually, Obama is not telling the whole truth.
If I may also add, really, it plays into, in a sense, it strengthens Obama's hands, as Mr. Nayar said, in consolidating the Hispanic community, other than the Cuban Americans, because it's a very large community. It voted solidly with the Democrats in the last election. And on the immigration issue, where Obama has already taken certain executive measures to ease the situation for illegal immigrants who've been in the US for a certain number of years and so on, and to make it easier for those who are doing their education in the US, he is already consolidating the Hispanic vote. Now, the Republicans, particularly those from Florida, like Marco Rubio, who's a presidential hopeful, or Jeb Bush, who's from Florida, the governor of Florida, and may run for the presidency, they would have to tread a fine line between alienating the rest of the Hispanic community and consolidating the Cuban vote, or, going one way. So
following up on what Ambassador Meera Shankar said, the Republican scene is going to be very interesting.
How they will tackle this.
Jeb Bush has a Mexican wife, you see, and Ted Cruz, who may be a presidential contender, he is of Cuban origin, who has lied about his immigration.
Very quick last words. You think this was more important for America to strike this deal than it was for Cuba?
It is important for both. I would rather say that we talk too much about the political impact within the US and Cuba. We are running out of time completely. Just two lines. It is going to have a good signaling from Washington, D.C. to other regimes like North Korean regime and Iran, who are terrified that America is always trying to change the regime. This is an indication that they want to live with different kind of regimes, and this is a good diplomatic signaling.
That's a very interesting thing way to end. It's a good diplomatic signal. We'll have to wait and watch what the next regime will do. But as far as this revival of ties is concerned, it's quite historic, as everybody says. We'll wait and watch how it will progress in the coming weeks and months. Thanks to all my guests, Meera, Shankar, Chintamani, Mahapatra, KP Nayar, and Kamal, Mitra, Chenoy. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue in the big picture, same time on Monday. Meanwhile, have a great weekend.